Hello, and welcome to the Project Good podcast. I'm your host, Anne-Marie Hilton. Project Good is a social impact podcast interviewing experts and advocates about the pressing problems that we face globally and hearing how they suggest we move forward in the future. The Project Good podcast is brought to you by Project Good Work. The goal of this podcast is to inspire people and organizations to develop a mindset that can move others to positive action regarding the complex social issues facing people and the planet. For March, we're focusing on what is feminism. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Susan Weidman-Snyder, who has spent her life as an activist, author, and editor dedicated to feminist change in the Jewish community. In 1976, she and other women founded Lilith Magazine to bring attention to sexism in Judaism and to push for feminist change. She has written on a wide range of issues, including intermarriage, conversion, domestic abuse, LGBTQ issues, and has never shielded away from controversy. Let's get into the interview. In 1976, after spending some time in Israel with her family, Susan Weidman-Snyder and a small group of women decided to start an independent Jewish magazine. They named the quarterly magazine after the Bible figure Lilith, Eve's predecessor in the Garden of Eden, who was expelled for wanting equality. Susan Weidman-Snyder and Lilith have been awarded a number of awards, and one of the most notable, the American Jewish Congress Eleanor Roosevelt Prize. The Israel Women's Network and American Jewish Congress honored her as one of a handful of women, including Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, to receive the Jewish Women Who Have Made a Difference Award. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you so much for having me, Anne-Marie. I'm delighted to talk to you today.
Yes, I'm delighted to talk to you too, and I'm so excited and glad that we finally got to do this. So before we get into the interview, I always like to know a little bit of personal information about people because it helps me understand kind of how they think and how they came to be who they are. So I guess there's so many things that women can do in the world. What drove you to want to start a magazine and really focus on women?
Well, certainly the seeds for creating Lilith Magazine were not sown by me alone. There have been, and there were certainly in the early 70s when Lilith got started, groups of women in academic life, women who were pressing for ritual changes as they were in other religious practices as well, looking for room within the tradition for women to have a greater range of expression. It was a time when the first women to be publicly ordained as rabbis in Judaism were making their case for admission to rabbinical school. And in fact, the Jewish community just celebrated a few months ago the ordination of the first woman rabbi officially ordained by a seminary, Rabbi Sally Priesand in the Reform movement. And, celebrating that 50-year milestone was pretty exciting. So the late 60s and early 70s were a time of excitement and turmoil for a lot of reasons. And women who had been active in, among other things, the civil rights movement, among other things in movements to the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, people who were looking for social betterment also turned their lens onto religious practice and spiritual practice. And Judaism, you mentioned in your intro, Anne-Marie, that Lilith Magazine addresses sexism in Judaism. And it was really more than that. It was the fact that Jewish women had been in the past closed out of halls of study, for example, closed out of various ritual roles. And at the same time, there is certainly growing room within Judaism, as there is in many other religious traditions, a certain elasticity and the excitement that was afoot in the early 70s was to stretch those boundaries for participation, not only to see women as religious leaders, but women as recognized community leaders, as the presidents of synagogues, for example, as people who were entitled to learn and teach religious texts. The Torah, which is the Bible, the Talmud, which are writings about scripture, and so on. So it was a time of a lot of excitement where women and other people were pushing the boundaries, wanting to have fuller experiences. So with that, a group of women, and I often say about myself that I came in on the sort of mezzanine floor. I had a very interesting lunch. I was doing a lot of freelance writing at the time with someone who said to me, well, a couple of us are talking about starting a Jewish feminist magazine. What do you think? And I said, it's a great idea, assuming somewhat naively that the project was much farther along. In fact, it was a gleam in the eye of a few very talented, very intelligent women from whom I was delighted to learn. And I was part of the cohort from about the second conversation onward. And out of those conversations grew Lilith Magazine, where I have been very, proud and delighted to be its editor-in-chief since its inception. It's been a fantastic learning experience for me, of course, and also a real opportunity to see change being made. Lilith's readership cuts really across all the dimensions of Judaism, from people who would consider themselves Jewish by ethnicity rather than necessarily by religious practice, all the way to people who are among the more observant of Jewish laws and customs. And within that, a big age range. We have high school and college students who have served as Lilith interns and who are avid Lilith readers. And we just started this year a cohort of writers over 40, emerging writers. And in that group of women we mentored and are publishing now, we have women in their 40s. And I think the oldest woman in that group is in her middle 80s. So it's been a very, it's very exciting to see what is happening at the present moment. The cover story of the current issue of Lilith is women writers over 40 make their debut. Pretty thrilling material in that. A lot of stories that wouldn't otherwise have been told if we hadn't quite deliberately set out to cast our net, invite people to apply to be part of this cohort.
Yes, and I only have I would say from my collegiate knowledge, I guess you would say, of Judaism, and then I guess and knowledge from friendships and things like that I have. But I have found, and the thing that always interests me about Judaism is that it kind of has a contrast, and what I mean by that is that it is traditional, but yet progressive at the same time. And what I mean by that is that, anybody that has any kind of religious background, specifically, I guess, if you tie in Judaism, and I'm just going to say the monotheistic religion, and know that, Judaism is the seed, the root of the start of, how we came to be as, humans and our life and our purpose and things like that as people. And, one of the things that I have, and that comes into, I guess you'd say, the traditional aspect of Judaism, and the, giving us our roles of what it means to be male, female, from the perspective of, the law of God. But I have also seen that from a Judaism perspective, and specifically when it came to civil rights, the people who were standing with African Americans and Blacks around the world were Jewish people versus anybody else. So that's what I mean by contrast, that I've seen it be something that is set in tradition, but is also progressive. And progressive, it should be that everybody is, seen the same, but we know the real world of how people look, and put people in boxes. And seeing that the religion itself has been progressive in pushing forward and standing with things that were, deemed, untouchable or scary in society. And the reason I'm bringing that up is that it then leads me to, Lilith Magazine, how you have then taken on this, approach to, empower women. So I find that so interesting, and also in a way like amazing that people should really understand that concept, that we're taking something that is, so traditional, but then also progressive. And that should open people's eyes that, I shouldn't say it, but that it's right in a way. And it's because, it's coming from the root.
I was just thinking, as you said that, Anne-Marie, about the progressive, in contrast to the traditional. And of course, in Jewish texts, there are lots and lots of messages about how you have to look out for other people, that you, in the Passover liturgy, which a holiday which is celebrated in the home, with special foods, the message there is, let all who are hungry come and eat. And the idea that there's a powerful message of repairing the world, tikkun olam, it goes in Hebrew, that you're supposed to really have as one of your goals while you're on this planet, of making things better. So I think you're right that there is a strong progressive sort of improvement thread that runs all the way through Jewish texts, through the liturgy, and through the practice as well. This strong contrast between what's progressive and what is traditional is found also even in the instructions that people are given for how you behave. If you are hiring someone to do work for you, you cannot hold someone's wages overnight, it says in the traditional text, because the person working for you will need those wages in order to have nourishment and shelter and so on. But what's also interesting to me is that we have, in what we think of as very, very traditional activities within the home, that same thrust toward looking out for other people, giving charity. Before you feed yourself, you're supposed to feed your animals. You're supposed to make a charitable contribution linked to all the holidays, including Sabbath observances. The reason that I'm chuckling is that I had a telephone call a while ago from a graduate student who said that she had been pointed toward Lilith because she was doing some work on what the early feminist magazines, second wave feminism magazines that had been up and running, say, by the middle 70s or the late 70s, when they were writing about food, it was always in a very negative way. Food was either something that kept women enslaved in the kitchen with food preparation, or food was dangerous and linked to eating disorders and sort of the male gaze on women's bodies and a desire constantly to keep your body in shape. And of course, Jewish women and like all other women, are falling prey to messages in the culture at large. But the reason that this graduate student was calling me is she said, I've gone through back issues of Lilith, and unlike any other periodical that is operating under the rubric of feminism, Lilith sees food in a positive light. And I said to her, well, food has been an important transmission vehicle for culture. Is certainly, there are traditional foods in Judaism for holidays, for Sabbath, as there are in many, many other religious cultures. But also that food has been a way that females have communicated with one another. And Lilith was always aware of honoring that, not just with recipes, but also with stories of food culture and how understanding different practices within Judaism. Jews who come from the Mediterranean or who come from North Africa, who come from Latin America, have different foods and different food traditions from Jews who are considered Ashkenazi Jews, who come from Eastern Europe or Russia. And what we learn about difference as well as similarity when we look at food culture. So there is, of course, that, as I think you aptly name it, a progressive strain within what we think of as traditions.
Yes. And, and also, you can correct me if I'm wrong, what I remember, because I studied some religion in college and things, and we would go on these, I guess you could call them trips and things like that we would go to different things from synagogues to, we even checked out the Hare Krishna, everything, and just learning about, why you believe what you believe, which I think it's important for people to examine that. And that it is the Jewish religion is also feminine in its origin, meaning that it runs usually through the mother. If I'm correct, if I remember correctly? And so, being that if it runs through the mother, it's naturally feminine. And having this discussion about feminism is perfect.
Hold on, perspective, because in fact, traditionally, Jewish identity was matrilineal, and if your mother was Jewish, you were considered Jewish. But now, certainly over the last probably 50 years, there has been a patrilineal descent stance as well. And now, for most Jews, there is one is considered Jewish if one identifies as a Jew and has at least one Jewish parent.
All right. So it's a little bit different. It's a little different now.
You're absolutely right. That traditional view was matrilineal. And yes, that there are also, of course, strong female figures in the Bible and in the second wave of feminism in the late 60s onward. One of the kinds of material we were seeing a great deal, we saw it a lot in Lilith, was the rewriting of Bible stories centering the women in the stories. The story of Hannah, who is believed to be drunk when in fact she is wailing and praying and offering the first petitionary prayer that's ever recorded in the Bible because she has not yet conceived and she's praying to have a child. And there have been many elaborations on her story. And a lot of these, they're called midrashim, a lot of these retelling of biblical tales circle around fertility, what happens with infertility, issues around marriage, childbearing, and so on. And we used to get a lot of fiction, actually, that we sort of dubbed, I wouldn't say unkindly, but in a slightly exhausted fashion, we dubbed ancestor worship, because for a while, this was the thread that ran through a lot of the fiction we received at Lilith. And in fact, I would love to share with you, and of course with your listeners, that Lilith has compiled finally its very first book after 45 years of publishing. We have just compiled a fiction collection called Frankly Feminist, Jewish Women's Stories from Lilith Magazine. And there aren't a lot of ancestor worship stories in here. They are very modern stories, despite the fact that some of them were first published in Lilith 45 years ago. And the title, Frankly Feminist, comes from Lilith Magazine's tagline, which is independent, Jewish, and frankly feminist. So we borrowed that phrase as the title of the fiction anthology. And the very first story in the collection, the stories are not grouped chronologically, but they're grouped thematically. And the first section of this collection is called Transitions, and it walks through or reads through the life cycle And the first story is called The New World. It's by Esther Singer Kreitman, the woman who was the sister of Isaac Bashevis Singer, the Nobel Prize-winning author who wrote primarily in Yiddish, and his sister, who was almost unknown at the point where we published this short story, also was a gifted storyteller. Isaac Bashevis Singer wrote the story that later became Yentl, the movie that starred Barbra Streisand, and many other wonderful stories and novels. And his brother also was a renowned novelist. The sister, who was told by their mother that she would never be marriageable if anyone discovered that she was a writer, the mother apparently destroyed all her early writings. Subsequently, she wrote, she published, she married, she had children, and one of her sons saw to it that her writing came to light. And what's fascinating about this story is it's told from the perspective of a not yet born daughter who says, I can't wait to get out of here. I'm in the womb. I wonder what the outside world is like. And she's born, and the family is grieving that she's not a boy, and they send her out to be taken care of by a wet nurse. And it's a fascinating beginning to this section called Transitions from Birth, or from an embryonic stage, through adolescence, a story by Mila Goldberg, who wrote the marvelous novel Bee Season, also subsequently made into a movie about a girl's experience at summer camp where she's bullied by the other girls and goes through a wedding in Persia where an Iranian Jewish girl is betrothed to a man she hardly knows, and what that's like, all the way through to death and a funeral scene. So that we have, with all these stories, what's to me a really fascinating admixture of modern sentiment, modern perspectives, interwoven with traditions, the traditions of, say, burial and what happens when you unveil a tombstone. And the second section of this book is called Intimacies, which is about intimate friendships, relationships that really don't often get exposed. A Jewish woman in 1919 goes to have her hair cut. The woman who's cutting her hair is a Black woman. How they interact. They both have their eye on the same man. What goes on in their rather subtle connection, what is spoken, what is not spoken. And on like that, a section on transgressions in which there's more about relationships that are disapproved of. There's Lot's Wife, a story, a really marvelous story by a gifted storyteller, Michael Lemberger, who describes how Lot's wife sets the town on fire so she can escape rapists with her daughters. The husband apparently is willing to offer up her daughters to placate an enemy, and she's having no part of it. It's pretty powerful stuff. Yeah, and more and more.
I love these stories that, just, I know you're just giving us little snippets, but, these touch on things that affect, obviously just not just Jewish women, just women in general. A lot of people, women know how complex women are. And I guess men do too, to a certain extent. That I was going to say women are complex, but I guess women know that and men know that. Aren't we all?
Very for sure. I think one of the great things about fiction is that we can enter into the lives of other people. We can write about lives we know well and lives we can only imagine. And I think it's one of the great gifts of fiction that it can inspire empathy in us. It brings us into lives different from our own, and sometimes lives different from that of the author.
Yes, I know. And it opens your whole mind, and you can, uh, to be in somebody else's shoes for just that moment, which I think is incredibly important right now in today's world. And, so in looking at all these different perspectives that you have in your new book, um, what would you say, I guess, let's start, I guess, at the top, because a lot of people have these misconceptions, especially when you say the word feminism, right? Sometimes it makes people retreat and curl their toes and want to turn around the other way. Um, and so I guess if you were going to give your own definition for feminism, what would you say it is?
I think feminism is the deep-seated belief that women are human beings. I think that that we are cut in very specifically gendered terms. Some of that makes sense, and some of it doesn't. So, until very recently, gender was a fairly non-negotiable category, although the Talmud and Jewish writings recognizes probably 5 different genders, that there are male and female, and then various points along the way that a lot of Native American cultures, a lot of tribal cultures recognize that there are gradations in those in the gender binary. But for the purposes of today's discussion, I think a straightforward definition of feminism would be one that acknowledges that all humans are created equal, that women, however you want to define that, are equally empowered in this world to have agency over their own lives. And I think that's a tremendously important and empowering definition.
Yes. Yeah. And I like that you brought up to have women have, agency over their own lives, bodies, and everything. Because right now, and this is my perspective, and I think it's easily being seen around the world if you're awake, that I feel like women are on kind of on their way to the extinction list. And what I mean by that is that, the push in this current state of the world seems to be that we're trying to push towards a like almost genderless, not able to, you have to be kind of, we're moving to kind of a genderless, I don't want, what do they call those? Can't think of the word right now. I don't want to say drone or droid or zombie or something like that. Then you no longer, you're just a human, but you don't have, you're not male, you're not female, you're just are. I don't even know what we call that. I'm sure they have a name coming up for it. And there's this push to take away what is feminine. And it's, become clear here. We have, we see what's going on in Iran with women. We saw, women cutting their hair to show their support. And we see protests here at the U.S. We experienced with the rights women, the Roe versus Wade situation, where women now have to, which was done away from. Women don't have that right anymore to choose what's going on with their bodies when it comes to birth. And just, everyday circumstances of what it is to be a woman is becoming, it's becoming controversial. They even had, I can't think of I have to remember the guy that I think his last name is Walsh, but I want to say it's like Matt Walsh, but he had a whole series called "What Is a Woman," and it actually caused an uproar. He was doing an online documentary series, and people got so very angry when he was going around and asking people for their definition. And it even had a time that somebody tried to shut down his show just for asking that question. So it's, to me, I can't believe we've gotten here to this point.
Well,
And
we are live in our bodies, and that we, I think, are approaching. I would hope that we are approaching a moment where we can respect the choices that individuals make about their bodies. Certainly, we're seeing that, especially for young people who identify as gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender, all under the category sometimes now of being queer, an honorific term, no longer an insulting term as it was decades and decades ago. I think both are true, that we are looking for a universe where we do not want to have gender be a limiting category where only boys can do this and only girls can do that. And the girls have to let the boys win at volleyball. And if a boy wants to paint his fingernails blue, that's absolutely forbidden because it is so frighteningly out of the gender binary. We see the absurdities to those rigid categorizations. On the other hand, if we're lucky enough to be alive on the planet, we are occupying bodies. So I think there is, when I said before that fiction allows us to be empathic about other people's lives, I think it's also true that in the ways that we live, we're looking for greater empathy. So I certainly side with those who are marching for women to have decision-making capacity of their own reproductive lives, for example. And there have been amazing surprises there, both good and bad. The fact that Ireland, for example, a country about whom it would not have been suggested a generation or two ago was going to be progressive when it came to abortion, has passed laws just recently that make it legal and safe for women to control their own reproductive futures. We have seen the same in some Latin American countries, surprisingly, also very recently. And yet, in the United States, we've had the confiscation of women's rights with the Supreme Court's decision to dismantle Roe v. Wade, which had been the law of the land for 49 and a half years. So certainly these issues around bodies and gender are not only top of mind, but also have been defining categories. Look, in this book of fiction, Frankly Feminist, one of the categories of the stories, as I said a moment ago, these are not divided by chronology, but by theme. And one whole section of short stories is entitled Body and Soul. One of them is the story of a Black Jewish woman marching on the streets of Washington after the George Floyd murder. One of the stories is looking at what we are told to do with our bodies. A teenage girl who wants to iron her hair because her hair is too curly and in her mind made her look too Jewish. The idea that women who aspire to live their lives more freely are viewed as dangerous. So again, it comes back to that idea of agency. Do those in power have the right to dictate terms about how we live in our private lives, how we make our own decisions about conception or family foundation, or whom we want to marry or don't want to marry?
Yes. And so one of the things, and this is, I guess, a two-part question. I I guess we have to look at why the world wants to control women. And then how does power play in feminism?
Such an interesting question. Well, if we think about how power plays out in feminism, I guess if we can think of this as having agency rather than power, we often view as power over others, as being able to control other people. Agency has to do with how we are able to express our own needs, find our own voices, speak our own truths, speak our own desires. And that those acts, the root word of agency is the same as the root word for acting, for act. If we imagine that by enacting our own truths, we bring about greater authenticity and maybe greater peace in a lot of different ways. In a domestic scene with parents and children, if there can be honesty without anger, relationships between partners, whether they are partners in a marital life or a domestic scene or living together as roommates or as lovers, as spouses, that allowing for the authenticity that gives the ability to at least say what one's desires are, not necessarily that we get to act on all those desires, but at least to be able to articulate them. And why the world wants to control women is that those who have it good or who feel their own superiority have benefited a great deal if they are able to be men and supporters of the patriarchy. They are not typically willing to give up their privileges. Why would there be? I mean, the same thing plays out when we see economic inequities. Certainly when we see racial and ethnic inequities. I think until the people wielding power over others see that a more equitable, peaceful environment, whether it's home or in the community or globally, is better for them too, we are still going to see these imbalances. Numerous studies, it's so interesting to me, numerous studies have shown that more egalitarian marriages, for example, that are more based on a more partnership model, have been proven to be happier. We can extrapolate from that, feminism has a lot to teach the world about erasing some of those tremendous imbalances.
Yes. And, you bring up a good point. Is I started thinking about, having that egalitarian marriage, and that it does make a big difference. And in today's world, it's kind of, I'm going to maybe insult some people, but it's kind of foolish to try to do, a one-sided and where somebody has more power versus the other one, because there are so many different things that you have to deal with that are different than, past errors. And it's we're living in a much more complex time. We're working different. You have to deal with so many different things that you didn't have to deal with before if you're trying to raise, children, especially if you have multiple children, that are maybe at different stages or in possibly different generations, that you're maybe dealing with, one child that's, that wasn't so influenced by technology versus now a child that, that's all they know. They never knew life without technology. And so you face different things. And so to try to be that one person is going to be quote unquote in charge and the other person is the follower, is almost just setting yourself up for failure in the future, because things are moving so quickly. There's no way that just one person alone can be like, oh, I can, this is what we're going to do. Because who can keep up with the changes that are happening just weekly? That's kind of an aside, but definitely I want to touch on that. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's a great aside because you make a strong case for diversity. that in fact not all people are alike, and it's like being at a wonderful banquet where you want to taste all different flavors, all different spices. That says we see it in family life, of course, where the young can teach the older ones about how you manage technology because they are digital natives, and those of us who are over the age of whatever we choose, 15 or 25 or 35, are digital immigrants. We don't speak that language as natives do. So I think that those differences are in many ways delightful and not only worthy of respect, but they make for a more bountiful and certainly more interesting life.
Yes. And one of the things in that we're always hearing, especially on the TV and articles and everything, and when people talk about, they want to, there's I'll just say there's a subset of I'll just call them, I guess we'll say, traditionalist women that are for the patriarchy, and then there's the other side that it's like the patriarchy has done too much. So when people are talking about the patriarchy, as people use that term and they toss it around like it's just a regular term now that has become kind of trendy. What exactly is the patriarchy? Can you explain for people?
Well, certainly in the roots of that, it is that there will be a ruling class and that the ruling class will be men. Patriarchy is a power hierarchy that has men at the top, and those men at the top are ruling over women and non-binary people and the animal kingdom. It's fascinating to read a book like Sapiens about the differences between humans and other species and how communities develop as well. Of course, there are leaders and there are followers in many different circumstances, but patriarchy, particularly as we understand it as a term of critique, is a definition of wielding power over others in a way that does not allow them the full flourishing of their humanity. And patriarchy can be seen in economic terms, in social terms, in the way that we distribute the good things of life. There have been cultures in which the men filed down the pointy teeth of the women because then the men could eat all of the rich foods like meat, would nourish them well, whereas women who weren't able to bite and chew meat were then left to sort of scrabble for what foods they could manage to consume. And that, I think, is a good example of the control over resources that is meant when we talk about patriarchy as a pejorative term.
Yes. And so I like that you talked about the filing down of teeth. It speaks to so many different things, not just, of course, of the meat eating, but just in society in general. And so, one of the things as we are facing these changed times, I will say that life is very different after this 2020 pandemic, whether people want to believe it or not. The world really has changed in how, people are looking at things. In that time that we had these 2.5 years, and depending on what country you are in, you are maybe still going through these lockdown years, unfortunately, have really allowed people to sit with themselves and think about, like, what exactly is this that we are creating in this world, and who am I, and what's my place in it? It's woken up people inside deeper than I think they ever would have been if they had not had this time. And so in that, we have to think about the world and how we're interacting with it differently because of the experience that we have just had or are having. So how can we go from this traditional type of patriarchy kind of look, and how can men start to embrace this new world and be, maybe feminists themselves, or start opening their mind? Because I don't think we're going back, as they say, we're not in Kansas anymore.
Right. Well, because of the lockdowns that the pandemic necessitated, the fact that people needed to pod up in smaller communities. And I say that understanding that it was a privileged position if you weren't a frontline worker, or you didn't have to go to work processing food so that people could still get food at a supermarket or at a bodega or get their food delivered. Certainly people working in hospitals. But for many people, the ability to work from home or work under slightly different circumstances meant that work lives became more visible. We appreciated all the different steps that go into keeping a society going. So that was actually one consequence of the pandemic, that there was a greater respect for what goes into keeping all those oranges in the air at once in a society. The fact that in New York City, every night at 7 p.m., I believe, people would go outside and applaud for people working in hospitals, people working in shelters, people working to keep others safe. And with that respect for different roles in society, I think we saw a shift on the domestic scene as well, when people were working at home more, if they, again, were fortunate enough to be able to continue to work and to work at home, and kids weren't in school, which took a terrible toll on kids, but everybody could see everyone else's life up close. Children saw mothers and fathers, or households that had mothers and mothers, or fathers and fathers, take on all sorts of different tasks, where everybody was responsible suddenly for making sure that there was food cooked and on the table, or the laundry got done, or the floors got swept. A much less industrialized universe than as to work in the long haul in the 18th, 19th century. One weren't working at home. Some of that may have softened the rigid ways that we, that we view gender roles.
Yes. Yeah, I think it made definitely, I continue to read articles about the impact that pandemic had on the domestic front, especially for women, that were then working and also taking care of the kid, or maybe they had to jump out of the workforce because you couldn't do it all. And then in some cases, then husbands did step up and they realized, okay, well, we have, 5 kids here, 3 have to do homework, 2 are still, babies. Somebody's got to cook. So I think it opened, hopefully, a number of men's eyes that the things that were considered, domestic work were really the work that made everything kind of function in the family. And because of that domestic work that was being done at home, it allowed you then to be able to go outside of work at home. So domestic work became increasingly important, I believe, during the pandemic. A number of people saw that, and they were also, of course, celebrating by baking a whole bunch of bread. So, yes. I think we all gained at least anywhere from 5 to 10 pounds, or maybe more, depending on how much bread you enjoyed. So with that, I wanted to kind of go into what would you think in this where we are now. And, of course, it's only the beginning of 2023. And it's hard to predict because, every year has been what I could say a surprise or shocker. And what happens since 2020. What would your prediction be for 2023 and maybe even beyond? Because, of course, something like getting people to understand feminism in a positive light is not something that's going to happen overnight. What would you say this year will be kind of, if you were going to come up with like a word or theme that would talk about where women are in society and how kind of move forward? I know it's a difficult question and it's hard to kind of, predict the future.
I think more and more we are recognizing that women's situations are more similar than they are different around the globe. March is marked as March the 8th, International Women's Day. And so I've been thinking a lot about the international part of that sort of artificial holiday, as it were. And it's so very clear that when it comes to reproductive rights, the autonomy of our bodies, our safety, the Me Too movement, the constraints on women's freedoms of all sorts. And this has to do with everything. What happens to incarcerated women when they are about to give birth? What are those situations like? And those are often horrendous, even in the United States. For women elsewhere, what is it like if they don't have access to contraception or if they don't have access to good gynecological care? And for women who are still earning less than men do, and we are now 50 years into the contemporary women's movement, and women have the same struggles that men do to sustain themselves, to have enough to eat, to have clothing, to be able to be safe from the environmental depredations that we're all going to face on this planet. So I think that we are going to see more and more this year and for a while to come, an understanding that we aren't siloed in our own countries.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's the perfect, like this year is, I would say, learning that we are a community, just where you are as a person, next door neighbor, but we have a larger community that we are all part of this, global community, and we're a lot closer than we ever could have imagined as we're seeing the same problems that we're dealing with here, you're dealing with there. So thank you so much for this fantastic discussion. And thank you, Susan, for your time and insight. If you'd like to learn more about Susan or Lilith Magazine or the new book, Frankly Feminist, Short Stories by Jewish Women, you can go to lilith.org. If you have a passion for an unserved community, a social justice problem, or simply want to change minds, contact Project Good Work at projectgood.org to start your project of change today. We're excited to announce in May 2023, we'll have our first annual Changemaker Conference. Go to www.changemakerconference to register now to attend. To our listeners, thanks for listening, and thanks for tuning in to Project Good, where we're focused on matter.